Where I've been living for the last 8 years, and this is the main salon. You know, it's got a couple of couches that pull out to form beds, so you actually can have a full-length bed on either side.
So where do you sleep? You sleep here or in there?
I sleep. This is my.
Well, that's your bed there.
Here. So, you know, it's got fans. You can see there's that's my tool chest there. I have my tools inside of there. Up in front is the head, you know, so it's a kind of head that you pump.
Yeah, I've seen those, yeah.
And it's, yeah, it gets the job done. Now, like, in the front here, or see the back, this is the navigation table, so this is where I have, you know, for instance, like radios, and, you know, that. So that's a single sideband radio, so it's a long distance radio.
What is, how much the distance, like how far?
It can go around the world.
Around the world?
Yeah,
wow.
It bounces off the ionosphere, the signal bounces off the ionosphere, and does sort of like that kind of a thing. So, but these other radios, like this one right here, and this one right here, are VHF radios, so they're basically line of sight, because you know the Earth is curved, so the radio waves can't. It's a ground wave, so it doesn't go up to the ionosphere. So that's good for about 20 miles.
So tell me when you would use this one, when you would use that one, like. Yeah,
well, you would use primarily you would use a single sideband out at sea, because like unless there was a boat right next to you or within 20 miles, they wouldn't be able to hear you. Whereas if you were having a problem, or let's say you have another boat that you want to communicate, which is 50 miles away, or you want to like get weather information, you'd probably have to use the single sideband.
Do you ever, say you're out at sea and, you know, hundreds of miles, maybe 1,000 miles from anybody, and another ship comes by, say 5 miles away or whatever, do you just chat with them on the bridge, or, you know, have a conversation, like kind of like truckers used to do?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a radio right here. It's behind my hats and stuff, but there's also a thing on that particular radio, which I talked about the other day. It's called AIS, and that means that another boat transmits a radio signal, and it shows up. There's a little chart that comes on there, and it gives you a visual representation of where that boat is in relation to your boat. So you can call them, you know, you can get on the radio and call them and say, hey, what's your position, what's your tension, so forth. So,
have you ever come across like somebody else on a sailboat, you know, similar to yours, and out in the middle of the ocean? Do you communicate, or? Sometimes, yeah, it
has happened. On the trip, the 40-day trip, I actually ran into some people that I knew from Panama, you know.
Oh, wow.
And it doesn't happen very often, but actually the routes that you take between places, you know, it could be a 50-mile corridor or something, but sometimes the boats, especially if they see you, because there's not much to block your view in the ocean, they'll come up to you, you know. That's definitely happened. Not that often, though. So, what else? The rest of it, you know, this is the galley. I have a double sink. On one side I have salt water, so when I do dishes I use, there's a foot pump down here where I can pump salt water, and then this is fresh water, but I'm a little low on fresh water, but it's the same kind of thing. So basically what you do is you clean the dishes, pots and pans, and salt water, and then you rinse the salt off with the fresh water.
Oh, okay.
As I said, I have a desalinator, a water maker.
Isn't salt water kind of a disinfectant in some way with the salt in it? Well, a little bit, like you have a wound or something?
Yeah, that's true. It is that way, but it can also cause infection, you know.
Oh, it can?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. salt water. You know, if you get a wound, you use hydrogen peroxide. You know, just like anywhere. You know, it's very important to have a good first aid kit.
I was just going to ask you that if you got a good first aid kit.
Yes, I do, and I keep it stocked. You know, although you know stuff goes bad, so you have to keep going through it and getting rid of old medications and stuff. But especially for things like infections, and you know, you got to have it, especially if you're by yourself. You know,
do you have anything like an anesthetic, like for example, you had to stitch yourself up or anything like that for Novocaine or whatever?
I've never had to do that, but I have had emergencies that I had to deal with. You know, cuts. I mean, you don't want to get cut on the boat when you're out at sea. You know, because I know one person that had to abandon his whole vessel. Believe it or not, he dropped his dinghy on his foot the day before he left, and he just thought nothing of it. Like 3 or 4 days out, got infected, and he's trying really hard to use the radio to call for help, but nobody came for a long time. And then eventually they came, and his foot was really bad, and they just gave him the when somebody comes in regard to your emergency signal, they don't tow your boat back. You know, they take you off the boat, and your boat just is gone.
That's it. Yeah,
it's a total loss. You know, and that's what happened to him. You know, he's either going to lose
your life or your boat.
Yeah, you definitely lose your life. I mean, I think his foot was getting gangrenous, and
well, if somebody changing the subject here, but if somebody came along and found that boat, like say 6 months later,
someone did find it. Actually,
can they keep it?
They can. I don't know the whole story, but I've definitely heard some things. And the guy had sort of relinquished his control of it. He just said, "Hey, I'm over it. You know, I don't want it anymore." Somebody found it, and they were going to give it to him, and he just said,
"It's all yours."
Yeah.
Free boat.
He was taken off. He put the sails up, and he put I could show you if you want, but there are several methods for the boat to steer itself, and he pointed it towards a far distant island, and sure enough, it showed up there.
Wow.
All kinds of things happen on the ocean like that. Not all the time, but yeah.
Well, let's sit down. Okay, everybody, we're back here with my new friend Philip, and he's kind enough to invite me on board his boat. And what's the name of your boat?
My boat is called Last Unicorn, like the
Last Unicorn, yeah.
The young girl's fantasy story. I didn't name it myself, but that was the name of the boat from the previous owner. But I think it's a pretty good name. So
that's a great name.
Yeah.
Now, when you buy a boat, can you just change the name if you want to, or is that a big process?
You can. Some people say it's bad luck. It is a bit of a process, and to me, I just don't see any need to come up with it. I've thought about naming it like Crowbar or Sledgehammer, you know, something like really Jack Daniels, but you know, but Last Unicorn. I get a lot of you know, little girls like waving at me, you know. So
would you have to change the name like in the country it came from, or could you do it in any country?
I think you'd have to go, because this boat is U.S. Coast Guard certified, so I'd have to go through the process of changing the name through the U.S.
Now, how often do you have to get the boat certified or checked or inspected?
It doesn't really have to. Periodically, like if you're in a U.S. country, they will board you and check all your safety gear. Yeah. But certainly in the Philippines, you don't do anything like that, you know. But yeah, you don't really have to do anything.
As far as maintenance, do you have like a schedule of things that have to be done? Like you've got to check certain things on the engine, certain things on the desalinization unit? Or... Yeah,
I do have that. I'm not like some people that are very meticulous, and I do keep a record, of course, but I do it according to a schedule, but I also do it as need be. So, you know, some things just, you can tell they're starting to get ready to break down, so you get in there and do what you can. But there's a lot of things like that. Well, certainly things like oil change is a regular thing, and the water maker, you know, all those things have to be done.
Is this a diesel engine?
Yeah, it's a diesel.
That's actually better, isn't it, to have the diesel? I heard that's less maintenance or more reliable. Or...
Hardly anyone has a gasoline engine in a sailboat these days. It's gasoline's a lot more volatile than diesel, and so, you know, chances of a mishap are greatly. So diesel is what everyone uses.
And how many horsepower is it?
It's 40 horsepower.
That's pretty big.
3 cylinders, Yanmar. And
so how far is like your range? Like if you were How far could you go if you had to? They say it was a dead calm and you had
Yeah. Well, I have 2 fuel tanks. Unfortunately, one of them has a small leak, which I have to identify. So that's empty. But together, they're 100 gallons. So I'd have a range of, so you'd have to multiply it out. But I'd say it's like 500 miles. Something
a long
like that.
ways, yeah.
You could go a long ways.
Have you ever been like a dead calm where you're out there and the ocean's like totally calm and you're out there? There's
Sure. And then you have the choice. Like some people won't even turn their engine on, even if it's calm. They're just purists. But to me, I generally like to get to a place because, you know, you minimize your exposure to storms. If you stay a long, long time, you know, if you're just floating and drifting, you know. So I tend to at least try to fire up the engine and maintain a slow speed, like maybe 2 or 3 knots, something like that. And there are sails that are good for very light winds, but at some point you just get no wind, you know, especially at the equator, you know. The equator is really, you've heard of the doldrums?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, the doldrums are typically like that because the air, instead of traveling horizontally over the surface of the ocean, is basically going upwards, you know, and so the wind is, you know, there's no side to side movement of the wind, so you have a lot of days like that, and that's when you motor.
Now, so you've been there for a year, so all your sails, are they stored away someplace? Or?
They are actually, and I'm just starting to bring them back on the boat. I have some at the place we were just at. They're in storage, and I'm kind of, they're very bulky, you know, and I keep them up forward, and you know, they have to be, I got to really squeeze them in there to get them in.
And can you put them on, install them by yourself, or you need help?
I can do it by myself, but it's a lot better with somebody else doing it. The mainsail, which is the biggest one, is really hard to do by yourself, but you can do it. It can be done. And the other big sail is called the jib, and that I have done by myself. You know, it's almost as big as the mainsail.
I'm surprised because it's a really hot, muggy day out there, and it's nice and comfortable in here.
Oh yeah, well it's very windy today, and I've got a couple hatches open, and I don't even have the fans on. But like last night, I was cold. You know, and I think you asked me the other day, like, where do I sleep better, on land or on the boat? And I thought about it, and I actually sleep better on the boat, you know, because it's quiet. I mean, the last place I was in Bowen, the dogs were barking all night, and karaoke, and, you know, I actually sleep quite well. But when you're on the ocean, you know, sailing, then it's a different story, you know.
And you don't have, is there internet right here where you are? Where you can,
yeah, I have Wi-Fi. I have, you know, I just have a regular cell phone, and I buy the plan, and there's a couple towers here. It's actually really good reception.
That's good. That's good. And so, tell me some things that have happened to you, like when you're, say, really far from land. Is anything like an accident or an emergency when almost in 8 years? That's a long time.
Well, I already mentioned a couple of things. You know, one was
you talked about the mast and everything else.
And I mentioned the thing about the exhaust, which was a really a bad timing. But I've also had some other things. For example, and a lot of this goes back to that typhoon, which really just did a number on me and the boat. But I had to, I don't want to get too technical, but there's an item that holds the sail, the foresail, out, and it's for going downwind. And that was damaged and actually was stolen in Fiji. So I had to make one. I had to make one out of aluminum, and I did, and it was pretty good. And I was going downwind one day, and I must have just taken my mind off what was going on, because the rope from the sail, the line from the sail, got caught under the solar panel, which I have on the outside, flipped it up, smashed it, and then it got tangled in that pole thing that I had. It's called the spinnaker pole or a whisker pole. And that thing just started thrashing around, and And, you know, when it was over, I had a ripped sail. The pole had done all kinds of damage. The solar panel was a complete loss. So I had to go into shore to sort it all out, you know, and I had to basically just rewire the solar panels and fix the sail. But, you know, that hasn't happened that many times, I got to say, you know. And I got to say, a lot of this were kind of like little time bombs that are a result of what happened in Fiji with the typhoon, because, you know, it's really hard to fix everything perfectly, and the ocean doesn't really forgive much. So if you take your mind off what you're doing like I did, and you know, you're not looking at the lines, you can get into trouble. And but you know, I've had things like that. I probably have related the main ones to you already. I don't want to make it sound like, you know, my trips have just been like a series of catastrophes, because other than the Fiji thing, it's been pretty nice, you know. And
well, the ocean kind of pretty much eats everything, doesn't it, after so much time?
yeah, and
Everything needs to be replaced. Like, do you find like your cell phone or computers or things don't last as long as they would on land?
Oh, for sure, yeah. The computers, you know, even if you keep them, I know people that keep them in a waterproof case all the time, but all it takes is one drop of salt water. I have a friend that she dropped just a drop of salt water and the whole thing was gone.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, that's part of the cost of doing it, you know. You can do things with metal. You can certainly paint them or use a rust remover, things like that. But, you know, basically it's kind of going through, whenever you see something that's amiss, you got to get on top of it, because it won't be long before it'll be.
So there is no metal that you can put on a boat that will not corrode eventually?
Well, here's the thing. There's something called electrolysis, galvanic electrolysis, and that happens when two dissimilar metals are in contact with each other, because the salt acts as an electrolyte, and what it does is it removes electrons from one metal and puts it on the other, so it's constantly like eroding the metal. What you have to do is insulate all those dissimilar metals, so to prevent electrolysis, because it'll eat everything. It'll eat your propeller, it'll, you know, and then one day it will just fall off, and that happens quite a bit, you know, if you don't pay attention to what is touching what, you know. So, but actually, if you just have like stainless steel, like that ladder you climbed up on, that's wet all the time, but it's just stainless steel. There's nothing touching it, you know.
Oh.
Even so, there is that thing is probably as old as this boat, you know, and I don't ever wash it, but it's just so
all the hardware that's attaching it to the boat has to be stainless steel as well, right?
Exactly, or it has to be isolated from each other.
We were talking earlier, and you were telling me about some interesting jobs you had. Like, you said you worked at a museum, natural history museum.
Yeah, I did. That was a pretty long time ago. I worked at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City.
Whoa, that's a good museum.
It's a beautiful museum, and it was always the place when I was growing up where I would go. Like, I would skip school and go there because I learned so much from being there. It's an enormous place, and I worked in the ichthyology department, the fish department, and so. But it was really a fascinating experience. I was a technician there, so I wasn't at that point. I didn't have. I had a bachelor's. So my job was to prepare specimens and to label and catalog specimens. And they have, I believe it's the second largest collection of fish in the world is there, after the Smithsonian and right before the British. I may have that wrong, but I know it's in the top 3 for sure. And so, you know, there's a lot of maintenance on that because you have to change the alcohol. Some things are preserved in different types of thing, formalin. But they had all kinds of crazy things in there, and I had all kinds of really unbelievable things I saw. My job, one of them was to skeletonize fish, which meant that we would obtain specimens, you know, like recently dead specimens are still, you know, like out of the freezer. And then I would dissect them, but you can't preserve them. So what you do is you cut them up like into mandible and, you know, the pectoral fins. And then you put them on a tray, and you present them to these colonies of beetle larvae. They're called dermestid beetles. And what they do, they have very small mandibles, and they slowly pick at the flesh until they remove everything except for the bones and the cartilage. But you have to be very careful, because if you let them go too long, they'll start eating the cartilage, and then you just have a pile of bones. And if you go even longer, they'll eat the bones. And if they run out of anything, they start eating each other, you know.
Whoa.
So, and they're very valuable. These colonies are, you know, and plus they're very, very cautious about preventing them from escaping, because the museum has just unbelievable wealth of specimens of all different kinds of things, you know. You know.
Where do they come from, these beetles? Like what country?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. I think they're native to North America, but I know they're called dermestid beetles, and that's the adult, but these are the larvae. It's like little caterpillars, you know. They're always wiggling around, and so, you know, I did that. Gee, I can tell you so many interesting stories about that. One time in the summer, New York City had a blackout, and there was an enormous freezer. I mean, a huge, it was bigger than this boat, you know. And they had specimens there dating back to the 1900s. And during the brownout, of course, the freezer, which kept everything frozen, just stopped. So I had the job, since I was pretty low on the totem pole, of removing all the decaying things and trying to save what I could, you know. And at one point, I took about a 10-foot mako shark out of there, and I was wheeling it through the main part of the museum, and it's like dripping blood because it's already like defrosting. I had to remove its jaws, you know, because that's the only thing you can preserve. There were all kinds of things, and like you know, elephant feet, you know.
You'd think a museum like that would have a backup generator or something.
You would think, but you know, this is quite a while ago, and I think the requirements for that freezer, that big a thing, they just didn't have one big enough, or they hadn't anticipated it. But things like that, they have one entire building that just has whale skeletons, and they're hanging from the ceiling on trolleys because people work on them, you know. And so you just see, like, you know, there's a humpback whale and a bowhead whale and right whales, and they're all, you know, like there, you know, it's like right there. They also have something that was really cool. It's called the Dinosaur Factory. And that's another building that, this is amazing to talk about, but they have real dinosaur skeletons there. But other museums want skeletons, but they can't. You know, there's only a few of them. So what they do is they recreate them. They take, let's say, a triceratops head, you know, and they spray it with latex, you know, rubber latex, and then they take that off. That makes the negative, and then they spray the inside of that with fiberglass. And when it's done, they have a replica of that triceratops head. And when you go in there, they have like it's like an assembly line where they've got, like, you know, skulls on the side, and, you know, and they have an enormous elevator. I mean, again, it's almost the size of this boat, for taking things from the 4th floor down to the basement where the Dinosaur Factory is. So they would take, let's say, a Brontosaurus femur, because they're really big, you know, they don't want to damage it, obviously, going up and down the stairs, so they use this big elevator to take it down to the Dinosaur Factory. There was a lot of things like that.
So that means that most of the museums, you probably, like, say I went to the museum in, say, Cincinnati, and saw a dinosaur.
It's most likely a replica.
Yeah, most likely. Well, that's kind of disappointing.
One thing about, well, you know, to tell you the truth, they do such a great, they have an incredible art department there. And obviously those kinds of things require a lot of attention to detail. And so they make them very, it's very authentic, you know. But it's true, the American Museum, Smithsonian's got, I mean, there are a number of museums throughout the world that have some dinosaur bones. The American Museum has a lot, you know, they have a lot. Sometimes they're not complete, but, and there have been cases like the museum, at one time, they discovered many years afterwards that they put the wrong skull on a brontosaurus.
I've heard about that. Yeah.
And so they had to, correct that. But there's been things like that, especially when bones get mixed up in the fossil record.
Isn't there a huge percentage of all the life forms that have existed in the history of the Earth? Isn't there a huge percentage of animals that existed, and we have actually, theoretically, of animals that existed, we have actually no evidence of them at all, no bones, no nothing.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
There's probably huge things that we...
Actually, it's not so long ago, but a lot of human evolution has not been preserved well because of the climate. They believe that our ancestors lived in areas that were quite moist and hot. Other places have been subject to geological cataclysms, whatever you want to call it, climate change. But the fossil record is definitely not preserved in its entirety. There are huge gaps, and I won't get into all the details about it. I'm a very strong believer in evolution, and especially working at the museum and just being a biologist for all these years, I see it all the time. It's just like so obvious. And but some people do point to the gaps in the fossil record as sort of like, well, how do you explain that? Well, the Earth changes a lot. And it's crazy to think that it has just maintained the same.
Also, have you ever seen like an animal, like in Africa, like a documentary, and the lions take down an animal? When they're done, the hyenas are done, the vultures are done. There's like hardly anything left. Then you got the sun and everything else. So there's not going to be a fossil there.
Well, that's true. Predation, carrion eaters, they tend to destroy a lot of things, disarticulate the bones, they spread them all over the place.
The little beetle you're talking about would eventually eat all the bones anyway,
Yeah, you would have anything,
You'd have nothing.
You just have beetle poop,
So unless like it's covered in sand or it's covered in mud or...
The preservation conditions have to be just right, and it doesn't happen that often, you have to have gentle, possibly siltation, like where the stuff comes down, there's no wave action. Oxygen, it's better to have them in a environment that has little oxygen, because oxygen basically enhances bacterial growth, and bacteria eat organic matter. So the list of conditions that would have to be present to preserve a fossil, but even so, we have a lot of them because the geological record is so long.
Right.
It's been millions, in some cases billions of years to accumulate.
People don't realize just how long a million years is. That's a long time.
But that's just a tiny fraction.
A little sliver.
When I was a kid, and like I said, I go to the Museum of Natural History. Most places have a thing, but this is one I always remember. It's like a spiral like a mural on one wall, and at the very center is when the Earth was formed. And then it gets bigger and bigger, and just way towards the outside, that's when life, began, about 2 billion years ago or so. And then at the very, very end, almost just like a hair, that's how long humans have been around. And the spiral, I can't remember how long it is, but the spiral is huge, what I mean? And we've been around for, according to when you consider humans to have develop Homo sapiens, 1 million years, 2 million years. It's debatable, but it's not, 4 million years ago they weren't around. There were hominids back then, but they weren't even close to being like us. So at 1 million years, that's just a...
So I read somewhere that in the history of the world, that like 90-something% of all life that's ever existed, plants, animals, insects, has gone extinct. Been replaced by other things, but they've basically gone extinct. Is that true?
Oh yeah, for sure. I'd say it's higher than 90%. But you got to remember that things are evolving and speciating at the same time. But I think maybe what you're talking, for sure, like most things have gone extinct. But they also are replaced by new lineages, like maybe one type of organism splits into two. But the other thing that maybe you're mentioning is that there are large gaps, extinction periods in the history of the Earth, at least 7, I'd say. And some people say that we're in the most recent one right now, caused by humans. But these things have resulted in geological time, almost an instantaneous extinction of most of the world's fauna, flora and fauna, plants and animals. And sometimes they're caused by meteors, sometimes they're caused by changes in the Earth's
volcanoes.
It could be by volcanoes. Yeah, it has been like that before. Yeah, but those periods are. There's always some survivors. There's some that make it through that. What do they call it? Like, it's kind of like a narrowing of the, they basically say, I can't think of the name for it right now, but it's basically the populations are reduced to a very low number, like just the amount viable, that the lowest possible breeding population. It's happened to humans before too.
Well, that was my next question, because again, something I read. I was probably on the internet, so it must be true.
Yeah.
That
I think I know what you're talking about. There apparently was a big narrowing of the population, human population.
Yeah, but they said like 70 people, like a really small percentage of people were left on the Earth after whatever it is happened. I don't know what it was that happened, but it could have been climate change, whatever. But
could have been a meteor.
But everybody that's here, of all races, descended in the last so many hundreds of thousands of years from this handful of people. And I guess that they weren't like 70 people on an island someplace. It was 70 people scattered around the world. I don't know where that number came from, but something like that. A very small amount of people were left in different pockets around the world, and from that, all of us 4 billion people or whatever came from.
I think they did that with a number of different
with DNA. They can detect that,
DNA and blood proteins and things like that. But essentially, you've got to have in that small population. There's got to be enough diversity that inbreeding doesn't occur, because that that results in combinations of genes that are not beneficial, and people die.
Does that depend on the animal though? Like, for example, you had 2 cockroaches.
It is very dependent. For example, cheetahs. Cheetahs, their population has been reduced to very, very low levels, but for some reason, nobody really knows why. Cheetahs are able to inbreed and not die out. They have something in their genetic makeup that allows them to, reproduce with their siblings and still, whereas other things can do things like, what am I thinking of? In the U.S., pumas, like cougars, mountain lions, they have really bad response to small populations. And a lot of times what happens is the males lose one testicle, when they begin to get inbred. So that's going to reduce their reproductive output, And so that's why they have programs in Florida. They've been bringing mountain lions from Colorado, which is essentially the same species as the Florida panther, to introduce genetic variability, because they just can't handle it. They can't handle the small numbers like the cheetahs do. And again, it's not really that well known why they do this, but it makes it interesting when you think about conservation, because like how small a population is big enough to replenish itself. Some things will just disappear. They'll just
like the Carolina parakeet, the pasture pigeon,
especially things like that.
They used to blacken the skies.
Yeah, well, and something, especially with birds, they require a certain critical population level to start the reproductive, the hormones and things like that. They don't breed normally if they have just too few individuals. They require like a gathering of individuals.
Flock,
They call it lekking. It's a term that describes when animals come together and they evaluate the ratio of males and females. It's just part of the natural cycle. They determined if, but they need that. They need that to initiate the breeding response, is what I'm saying.
Well, going back to inbreeding, isn't there small populations of humans like in New Guinea and in the Amazon where, a village of maybe 100 people, so there must be
Yeah,
inbreeding.
I think
And you
humans are not quite like cheetahs, but they are able to keep going with a small thing. But you know, you've heard of inbreeding, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's not a good thing for a population.
And if you're a
because
religious person, go to Adam and Eve. There was just two people, so there was had to be some inbreeding going on there.
Yeah, so I think humans, maybe that could be one reason why humans have been successful. Well, there's a lot of reasons, but that's definitely...
Well, I'm going to wrap up this one segment here, and we'll do another one here. So this is the end of part 1 of this new series, and we'll pick it up on the other side.